I think this is one of those evenings where we're all quite glad not to have had to go outside and venture into the dark and the rain and the sleet, possibly even. But a very warm welcome online to our second Holy Ground lecture of this winter. My name is Laura Moffat and I'm the Director of Art and Christianity. We're just a small organisation exploring the relationships between Christianity and other faiths and the visual arts. This programme is obviously a response to the climate change emergency that we find ourselves in. And it's really a way of trying to ask whether we can perhaps re-energise the commitment of people of faith to being stewards of the earth. And obviously, I think many of us are aware of attempts by, for instance, the Church of England, who have recently called for a target of 0 carbon emissions by 2030 in all of their buildings. Now, obviously, those are huge targets to take on, but the way which we have felt we could perhaps approach this is through perhaps slightly more sort of conceptual or even emotional ways of thinking about imagery, about form, and the creative act, I think, of ways which we might explore our relationship to nature and to ecology. In our last lecture, which we had 2 weeks ago and which you can find online, there's a link to it from our events page on our website. We had Rachel Morley, who is the director of Friends of Friendless Churches, who gave us a wonderful insight into a relatively small number of churches that they look after, which hold this incredible sort of rich and vivid collection of visual references to nature within the churches, as well as, of course, the setting, very often rural churches set within fields, forests, whatever, and just what a kind of influence that has on the building and on the art and architecture within those buildings. But this evening's lecture is an opportunity for us to look towards another faith. And we're really delighted that Tim Winter is joining us this evening to explore the building of Cambridge Mosque, the Cambridge Central Mosque, which was only completed in the last year, I think, if I'm right in saying that. Tim's involvement goes right back to the beginning of the project 11 years ago, and he is the chair of the Cambridge Mosque Trust, which has been responsible for building it. Tim is also the Sheikh Zayed lecturer in Islamic Studies at the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge University. And he recently contributed a chapter on creation spirituality to a recently published book called Travelling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe, published by the Quilliam Press. So before I hand over to Tim, I might just mention, please, if you could just keep yourselves on mute for now while Tim speaks, and then do feel free to unmute yourself afterwards or to use the chat function and just admit somebody who's there, or to use the chat function, and we'll chair the questions that way if you wish as well. I'm going to be moving on slides as Tim talks, which may or may not correspond all that well to what he's saying, but Tim has preferred to just speak to you, and I'll try and just key in a few images for you to see as we go along. Okay, so over to you, Tim.
Thanks so much, Laura. I must say I've been looking forward to this for some time. I think that there's something rather drab about the lockdown, and it's refreshing to encounter new groups of people with fresh perspectives. So hopefully this won't be too depressing for everybody. Also as a gesture of Abrahamic hospitality, because I'm a Muslim and this is an art and Christianity group, so I do very much feel honoured that I've been allowed in, as we say nowadays, to share our experience of our project in Cambridge with you. Because the whole idea of creating a mosque in a UK historic town might seem sort of an unfamiliar scenario to you. Let me just give you a little bit of background to explain who the Muslims of Cambridge are, the kind of basic demographics. One of the first things we did was to look at the kind of prehistory of the Muslim presence in Cambridge. And there have been Muslims worshipping, it seems, in Cambridge since the 1880s, 1890s. A few, usually Indian students who came when it was, the tripos regulations were changed to allow native students, by which they meant Indians, to take the Indian civil service exams. So we started to get observant Muslims from that time, but we're rather behind even that other place, Oxford, which now has 4 purpose-built mosques, and we thought it was a little bit depressing that in at least one area of endeavour, if in no other, Cambridge is lagging behind them. So there are about 7 mosques already in Cambridge, but they're generally small houses or warehouses that have been converted, but the demography has been increasing. So the first thing we did about 10 years ago was to look at the census returns, which now, of course, indicate religious self-identification. So you can actually, without paying anything, which is nice, go online and work out what is the religious composition of your locality. So we found that there's about 6,000 self-identified Muslims eligible for census in 2011. There's also a floating population of students and others who may not appear in those figures. But the demographic breakdown was really interesting because there is no preponderance of any ethnic group. Cambridge being this global hub is quite unlike some other Muslim concentrations in the UK, which tend very often to be dominated by single ethnicities. So we saw that the local Bangladeshi community is about 32% of Cambridge Islam. And then an Arab community, Nigerians, the Chinese Muslim community. About 11% of Muslims in Cambridge self-identify as white European. So that meant immediately that in terms of choosing a design idiom, we were relatively free to do what we wanted because we weren't going to be subject to overwhelming pressure from a given group of people in a particular background who would be rather sad if we didn't build a mosque that looked like somewhere in Egypt or Pakistan or Uzbekistan or wherever. And that was quite liberating. We were quite advantaged to be unshackled in that way. The site, many of you might even have passed the new Cambridge Mosque site. It's on the unfashionable side of Cambridge, the wrong side of the railway tracks down Mill Road. It used to be an industrial site. Then it became the Magnet Bold, which was one of the first 10-pin bowling alleys in England. Then it was a John Lewis warehouse. Then it was made redundant from that, and we bought it when it was in a rather shabby kind of brownfield state. And we bought it in 2008. So since the mosque only opened in April last year, it's been quite a long journey. Then there was the epic of getting it through planning, process of which I shall draw a veil of silence, I think, but it's complicated. Cambridge residents tend to be hypersensitive. You change the colour of your front door and people are immediately writing letters to your local councillor, and it's that kind of place. However, we did find that the local residents were actually very much in favour of having a place of worship and a mosque on the site once they saw that we were collaborating with them and that we wanted to provide a hub that wasn't just for the Muslim community to keep us out of the rain on Fridays, but would be accessible for all members of the community as an exhibition space, for instance, cafeteria, a little garden at the front. So once they saw that, actually we had tremendous support, almost unanimous, I would say, from local residents, which was quite heartening. We had an international design competition, one of whose criteria in the brief that we sent out to, it was about 12 architectural practices worldwide that submitted bids for the competition, was that it should be a sustainable building, an eco-mosque, which is of course a very vague kind of term, and should reflect in its architectonic vision Islam's view of humanity as the harmonious link between heaven and earth, and therefore the natural custodian, but also guardian of the natural world. That was about as theological as we got with these sometimes quite sort of secular-minded architects. We had a short list of 4, all of which were very interesting and inventive solutions to the quite knotty problem of how you create in an English country town within a mile or so of masterpieces such as King's College Chapel, in the current somewhat fraught debate about Islam and the West, East and West, integration, ethnicity, security concerns. The EDL marched a couple of times against the building. So it was culturally a complicated argument. And the winning design came unexpectedly from a practice called Marx Barfield, who are best known perhaps for the London Eye, which is the Ferris wheel opposite the Palace of Westminster. They've also designed the Kew Walkway. They're very high-tech and innovative, but they are also, I think, at the forefront of sustainability-oriented art and design and technologies. So they won this competition, and David Marx, very interesting Jewish guy, actually, I think the first Jew to have designed a mosque in the UK, told that we didn't want to cramp his style, but we wanted a vision that would reflect Islamic conceptions of sacred spatiality, that would reflect a positive message about religion and the environment, and would give a sense of welcome to local communities, and also a significant nod in the direction of the local architectural heritage, which is actually quite a difficult brief. Came up with something that none of us had expected, which was, from the outside, you can see in this slide, almost predictably in an eco-mosque, you have a photovoltaic array on the roof. And behind it, you can see the brick, which is Cambridge Galt brick. So the construction techniques, as well as the long-term energy conservation measures in the mosque, have to reflect sustainability principles as much as possible, which often means sourcing materials locally and using renewable materials as much as possible. The dome was kind of an afterthought because members of the Cambridge Muslim community thought that it would be a bit of a shame if you didn't have a dome on a mosque. So we got that, but actually it's proved an enormously popular feature. The awareness of environmental issues amongst Muslim communities is growing rapidly, not least because climate change is actually more of a life or death issue in the Muslim world than it is in most Western countries, for the simple reason that the Muslim countries are located laterally on a band of the Earth's surface that is particularly vulnerable to climate change and rising sea levels and changing patterns of precipitation. So the Hindu Kush assessment, which came from a group of environmentalists last year, points out that by 2050, on current best case scenarios for global warming outcomes, over 30% of the glacier cover of the Himalayas will be lost, with the results that you will find that the riverine valleys of the subcontinent, which means most of Pakistan and Bangladesh particularly, will be literally uninhabitable because of disastrous floods and also the incapacity of the rivers to gently and systematically deliver meltwater from glaciers that will no longer exist. So we're looking at, according to this report, maybe the displacement of about 150 million people, most of whom will be Muslims. That's just one example. A 1% increase in global temperatures would result in a 70% diminution in agricultural land in Algeria, for instance. So whereas in the West, in the north of Canada and Siberia and Patagonia, the permafrost is melting and agriculture is becoming possible, those demographies can migrate northwards, but Muslim countries do not have a similar option. And so climate change refugees are already arriving in the UK, but I think that's just, as it were, the tip of a truly gigantic iceberg that's going to be affecting relations between the West and the Islamic world and internal security issues for really for the foreseeable future. The Muslim world itself, being aware of this, is taking steps. I was pleased to see last year that in the Climate Change Performance Index, which is a global index which measures national compliance with sustainability agendas, Morocco was very nearly in first place. They were just beaten to first place by Sweden. And the Moroccans now have 50% of the country's electricity generated from sustainables. And in fact, the company that produced the photovoltaic cells, which we've just seen in the slide, which is a Muslim-owned company in Harlow, they actually gave us this technology, is involved very significantly with the Moroccan government in providing photovoltaic arrays for major mosques in Morocco. So Morocco is a good example, and the theologians there have been putting their shoulders to the environmentalist wheel quite successfully. Egypt is creeping up, so I think they're 19th in this scale. America is at 61, just by comparison. Indonesia is very interesting. And the new first ever female Grand Mufti of Indonesia, Hosema Yango, is a keen environmentalist and has launched a campaign for 1,000 new green mosques in Indonesia every year. There's 1 million mosques in Indonesia, so that's a drop in the ocean. But she's also presided over a new fatwa, a religious edict, that makes it a crime, but also a sin, to light a fire in a forest anywhere in Indonesia, because they've had significant problems of wildfires and deforestation. So the penny is starting to drop across the Muslim world, where it really is a matter of survival. So the theology which is behind that is also, as you'd expect, developing rapidly, but is already there really in the particular Quranic vision of who we are, where we're from, what we're for, how we deal with other life forms. The key Quranic verse is perhaps, there's a nice picture of the interior of the mosque. There are women in the mosque as well. They have their own designated zone, and there's various other images coming up. But the theology is rooted really in the doctrine of God's 99 beautiful names, which are mentioned in the Quran and which are taken to be the warp and woof of creation. Everything in the world represents a combination of the action of one or a plurality of the divine names. So everything in the world represents, in a sense, the divine attributes. So there is a famous verse, God is the first and the last, and the outwardly manifest and the inwardly hidden. Inwardly hidden is theologically easy to account for. The outwardly manifest is the divine name that the environmentalists are particularly interested in. In other words, the world is not just created by a personal God that keeps aloof from the fabric of what he has made, but participates constantly in the divine being. This is the doctrine known technically as Nafas ar-Rahman. In other words, in every infinitesimal instant, God is exhaling. This is the metaphor that we use, and the world is the divine breath. And in each instant, of course, it's different, and we take there to be causal chains and cause and effect, but in fact, everything it partakes at all times in the unity as manifested in the pleroma of being that is the divine. So it's not a dualistic system. It's a theistic system. It's not like some of the slightly Neoplatonic paganisms that are rampant perhaps in some environmentalist circles, or the pantheism that some green eco warriors have bought into. It's still a theistic system. Everything is emphatically subject to the will of a creator God. But because one of these 99 names is Al-Qarib, the near, and the Quran says God is nearer to man than his jugular vein. This idea of divine immanence with an A is really critically important and means that nature is not just there as to give humans, as the Roman law put it, jus utendi et abutendi, to be used and abused, but because it is, in a sense, the substance of the divine attributes, it is shot through with holiness. God is the light of the heavens and the earth, as the Quran says in many places. Added to this is the fact that the Quran proposes really as its only argument for the existence of God, a kind of argument from design. Look around you, it says, at the order of nature, and if you have your wits about you, you will naturally infer that this didn't pop fully formed out of some primordial void, but shows every sign of having been designed, sculpted, caressed by a merciful and benign and wise God. And therefore, the conservation of the world is not simply, as it is for many secular people, a utilitarian matter of conserving our life support system, even though that's pretty vital. Without nature, we'll all die, but is also significant because one is conserving God's signs. Everything in virgin nature points back to its perfect source. We take a moment, and of course this is widespread in Christian spirituality as well as in that of Islam, you put your phone down for a moment, you look around, and you are, as we say nowadays, mindful of the world, and you will intuit, unless you're really spiritually rotten, that there is more going on than meets the eye. Impressionistic, subjective, no doubt, but without our subjectivity, we're not human. And we trust that intuition, although, of course, the philosophical theologians make a lot more of it than that. So the world is made of God's signs. The Quran says, we shall show them, that's us, our signs on the horizons and in their own selves until it becomes clear to them that he is the truth. So God shows us the world as creation, and also shows us signs within ourselves, a sort of Kantian mystery of consciousness and the moral law, which bespeaks transcendence, until the penny drops and we realize that we're not alone. So there's a strong theological reason, or as a vital one, for conserving the integrity of nature, because nature puts us in that zone that enables us to intuit and to love God. Moreover, and Muslim eco-theology does tend to be very sort of scripture directed, there are some, perhaps in a monotheistic context, somewhat startling verses which indicate that creation is participating in a kind of cosmic symphony. So a verse, this is, if you want the reference, Surah 17, verse 44, there is nothing which does not glorify him with praise. In other words, everything in the world is engaged in sort of singing hymns to the Almighty in its own way. And one of the things about the Prophet of Islam, who is obviously our founder, but also identified with a particular type of creation spirituality, is that he could hear that praise. So there's scriptural texts in which he picks up some pebbles when walking on a mountain with some of his disciples. And because of his spiritual power, the disciples are actually able to hear the pebbles praising God. Doesn't work for me, but we have it on scriptural authority that this is what he could do. And many hadiths, the hadith is the second scripture of Islam after the Quran, which indicate his particular respect for and insistence on honoring of the natural world and particularly of animals. So a couple of hadith here, well-known scriptural texts. A sparrow killed in vain will come to stand before God's throne on the day of judgment, crying, "O Lord, this man killed me pointlessly for no benefit." In other words, the idea is that even the animals are going to grumble about us because we're abusing their habitat. The other one, a man asked the Prophet, "Is there a reward for the charity that we give to animals?" He answered, "For every being possessing a moist liver, there is a reward." In other words, for any kind of, I guess, creature with flowing blood, this moist liver is a rather unclear expression, really. So people will argue about whether it includes cockroaches and the like. But it's always been an important part of Muslim ethics, following the prophetic examples that kindness to animals is just an obvious part of being a decent, believing human being. Other incidents, and for every Muslim school child learns these stories, the Prophet was once passing by an enclosure in which there was a camel that was kind of crazy, running amok, and people were afraid to go into the enclosure. The Prophet, against everybody's advice, enters and puts his hand on the animal's snout and looks at the camel, and the camel looks at him, and the camel calms down. Then afterwards he comes out and says, "This camel told me that it's being given too much work and not enough food." And so, of course, the story has the ending of the farmer comes up in tears saying, "A messenger of God, it's true." And so, of course, because the man repents, the camel is then exempted from any further duties for the rest of its life and given the best possible fodder. So there's lots and lots and lots of material like that, of creation care in the core Muslim scriptures themselves. So it's kind of native to the Muslim tradition. So when we finally, to get down to the topic of the mosque, this is, even though it's neglected in some Muslim contexts, something that is naturally part, I think, not just of Islam, but of monotheism generally, that one regards creation and the beauties of the organic world, not just as a resource, or maybe not even primarily as a resource, but as something that is sculpted by the benign, compassionate God, and that has its own right to exist in creation. So another verse of the Quran, sorry to be so scriptural today, which I've always found quite startling, is there is no beast that crawls upon the earth, nor any bird that flies with its two wings, but that they are nations like yourselves. So I looked up the commentaries, and they are also a little bit bewildered by this. How can they be nations? And how can they be like human beings? In what sense are they like human beings? So they come up with a lot of different explanations. But one thing that everybody agrees on is that just as you can see the map of the world as we usually see when we look at an atlas, sort of the political map, different countries, and that's really from a human perspective, you can also see it from the perspective of the distribution of the nation of the rabbits, or the nation of the horses, or the polar bears. That is also, from this scriptural optic, another way of looking at things. And I find that each time I see a dead hedgehog by the A14, a rather depressing thought that there's a kind of genocide going on, because these are also peoples in some sense, and also giving praise to God. So there is a kind of, Islam emphatically is not pagan, but there's a kind of, technically speaking, pre-axial reverence for nature, in a sense that nature does have a sort of consciousness that feeds into Islamic art in particular. So if Islam is big on the signs of God in nature, what does it do in a building? Well, you could say that, of course, there's a great tradition of garden design. If you've been to the Alhambra, you'll have seen the gardens of the Jannat al-Arif there, particularly well arid climates. And of course, the fact that we come from a garden, Eden, and we're heading for another garden once we leave this mortal coil, also gives the presence of a garden a kind of paradisal, refreshing sense, that nostalgia that we feel for a place that's familiar to us that we have lost. So we have gardens at the front of the mosque, and Emma Clark, who is the Prince of Wales's designer of his Islamic garden at Highgrove, did the design for us, and it's a very popular feature, and it's open to the general public. You don't have to come to the thing to worship in order to sort of sit around on our benches and just to enjoy it. So you move from the street, which is Mill Road, busy, to two different gardens. There's a public garden, and then there's this image shows you the sort of more Islamic garden with the fountain. Again, that's a feature traditionally associated with paradise. In the Muslim scriptures, there's the idea of a fountain in which the faithful are cleansed before they enter paradise, to take away all of the sort of residual suffering and the grief that they might have with them. And so to have a fountain in a mosque is a kind of traditional reminder of that. You'll notice also, I think, yew hedges, Y-E-W, which is really not something from Islamic design, but reflects the way in which we wanted to locate it in an English environment, because English churches, particularly in rural environments, have yew, and that's even pre-Christian. In some cases, the yew predates the church, I believe, because the yew was sacred to the Saxons and then the pagan Vikings. It has symbolism in Germanic mythology. So we thought, well, why not introduce that into our Islamic garden, just to indicate that we're kind of being suitable to different narratives rather than plonking something Middle Eastern in the middle of Romsey Town in Cambridge. So yeah, the yew marks the end of the garden and the beginning of this portico area. And then you can see the main feature which David dreamed up, this wasn't mine at all, is these amazing tree-like structures which are made from sustainably harvested forests, and it's cross-laminated timber, engineered, done by a brilliant Swiss company. And the idea here is that we'll be, that picture I think I took, if you can go back to the previous image, in order to the architect for having forgotten that birds might also be interested in this particular design feature. So you can see we have a pigeon issue. But yeah, in this image, you can see that the tree soars up and then the branch of the tree protectively close to provide one with that amazing sense of sort of shelter and sanctuary that you experience in the forest. But the way in which they close reflects two things. Firstly, you can immediately see the influence or the reference to Gothic fan vaulting. And we have King's College Chapel, maybe the best example anywhere of fan vaulting just down the road. So it's our kind of referencing of the local. And incidentally, if you look at Diana Dark's new book, Stealing from the Saracens, the whole book is about how the Gothic style comes from the Islamic world anyway, because it was brought back by the Crusaders. Before then, there was the Romanesque. And of course, Christopher Wren, asked why he'd chosen the Romanesque sort of Palladian style for St. Paul's rather than the Gothic style, said, well, the Gothic style is not Gothic, it's Saracenic. So he didn't see the Gothic as being Christian. Well, of course, it's Christian and it's Muslim, it's an architectural style that everybody can equally partake in. But so you have that reference to, and it's one of the things we point out to school children and other visitors, that despite the them and us, East versus West binary that the journalists and the fundamentalists thrive on, the reality is that there's always been creative, mutually beneficial, cultural interaction between the Islamic world and the West for at least 1,000 years. So that's the first thing you see, but you also notice that it's not quite fan vaulting because it picks out a distinctively Arabesque pattern. And David wanted that to be one of the key Islamic references in the building. Now the tree is, again, paradise is depicted as a forested space, and the Prophet's own sanctuary mosque in Medina was a very simple building with palm trunks with palm branches on top just to keep out the worst of the sun. But a forest gives you a kind of numinous sense, a sense of enclosure, and also surrounds you with nature rather than just putting nature in a particular place. You are entering nature when you're in a forest rather than just looking at it. So the tree trunk symbolizes the point at which our experience of the world turns out to ramify in ways which are actually ordered. The point of Islamic art, which of course doesn't like to use images, is that the sacred is perceived in nature, but sometimes just beneath the surface. That the order of things, nowadays we can see things with electron microscopes and get to see all kinds of new patterns, that the order of the world is actually presented, despite the apparently rough interface of nature itself. This muddy world is actually made up of beautiful arithmetic, mathematical, Pythagorean patterns and geometries. So Islam really likes geometry, sacred geometry. So there's a lot of geometric symbolism in the building. And this was designed by somebody called Keith Critchlow, who sadly died recently, who again was sort of part of the Prince of Wales Institute team, probably Britain's best known expert on sacred geometry. Not a Muslim himself, he's done things in Christian and I think Hindu context as well. But he has a great book on Islamic patterns and the symbolism of Islamic patterns. And unfortunately, I have not retained many of the finer things that he was explaining to me in his deployment of sacred geometry in the building. And much of it is not sort of philosophical, but more alchemical, because it speaks to the soul rather than to the thinking aspect of ourselves. He also has a truly amazing book, I think his last book, which is on the geometry of flowers. Really beautiful, wonderfully illustrated book in which he shows the sort of marvelous patterns and geometries and symmetries that you find in the world of flowers. So the stars are typically 8-pointed in the mosque, and that is in traditional Islamic symbolism a mapping of the interface of the celestial and the earthly represented by the 4 points of the compass, and also by the 4 humours and other 4 things, 4 winds. And the divine also, the divine throne is fourfold. The Kaaba, which is the earthly symbol of the throne of God, has 4 corners. And so they interface, and humanity is at the center of that. Human beings are considered to be in the middle, as a mysterious place where we are in God's image, as Islam says, just as Christianity does, and therefore, in some sense, a sign of transcendence that is potentially a better sign than anything else in the natural world. So a mosque is a shrine for the divine presence, but also for the miracle of humanity, the beauty of humanity, the diversity of humanity, the capacity of human beings to come into a mosque, burst into tears, repent, get married, have their funerals, all of these most paradigmatic human events, the things that really mark us out as extraordinary and special, happen in sacred places. So it's a celebration of the human as well as of nature and of the divine. So I don't know how much time I've got left, Laura. I tend to go on more or less indefinitely about the mosque in Cambridge, but could you give me a heads up as to how much more time I have, or should I?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, thank you.
I'm just trying to find another couple of slides, which I.
Okay.
It's
Well, if you look at our website, yeah, this is the teaching room. Thank you. And these are some customers. The building, I should have mentioned, is not just a prayer space, but also has exhibition spaces and spaces for conferences. So this was set up actually for a conference that we organized jointly with the Faculty of Protestant Theology at Tübingen University in Germany, which was about green theologies in Islam and in Christianity, it was wonderful actually to have an academic event that was kind of interfaith as one of our first significant events in the new building. And symmetrical with this, on the other side, there is a cafeteria space, which can also be used for exhibitions and is a place where passers-by, even if they're not interested in religion, can stop for cappuccino and chat and socialize. So it's very much a social hub as well. Back to practical matters, yes, there you can see one of the ladies' spaces, in order to encourage female participation, because it's a pretty young community. Average age is about 33, 34 of the mosque-going Muslim community in Cambridge. There is always a problem with young children in places of worship. We want them to come, but sometimes they are a little exuberant during services. So we have this space, which is one of the female designated spaces, where mothers can bring their children and they can see what's going on in worship, but it's quite thoroughly soundproofed, so the kids don't make the mothers feel bad or feel that they have to stay away from the mosque until the kids grow up a bit. So we do try, although this is a little bit outside sort of the area of the eco features of the mosque, to encourage female as well as male participation. I should also say it's non-denominational, so it's not Sunni or Shi'i or belonging to any particular orientation. So usage, yeah, we are at capacity before the lockdown anyway. 1,000 people would come, which is our official maximum capacity. And sometimes we have to stagger the ceremonies. So Friday, sometimes we have 2 services, one after the other, so the numbers don't get too overwhelming. But yeah, it is very well used, and it's good to see marginalized communities like the Syrian refugee families who are in Cambridge coming along, and other people who sometimes feel a little bit left behind in what is in some ways quite an unequal city, I would say. So yeah, there's an image you can see of the screen, which separates the male from the female areas, and then calligraphy, which is donated by a Turkish calligrapher on the wall, and then one of the octagonal lanterns above that. The eco features, apart from the kind of theology of the building, would include the photovoltaic arrays, which I've already mentioned. They generate maybe 15% of our power. They're not that great, but it does make a difference. But we also have something called a big air source heat pump, which extracts warm air from the air even on a cold day, and also aids the thermal efficiency of the building. We have no hydrocarbon burning on the building, so everything is electric. There's no air conditioning because the walls are thick, so even on a summer's day, it's perfectly perfectly temperate. We have rainwater harvesting on the roof, which is obviously used frequently in Cambridge, but which is used mainly for irrigating the gardens and for flushing toilets and grey water use. It's legally quite complicated if you use rainwater, drinking water and so forth, but we do have that facility installed. Various other functionalities of the building would include the mortuary, which we have, which is usable for COVID casualties, although it's really quite a palaver. Everybody has to be in full PPE with visors and filters and things, and you can't open the coffin. It's a kind of rather science fiction type environment, but obviously we do have those beginning and end of life ceremonies going on in the mosque. So that essentially is what we have sought to do, and it has been actually very reassuring for us to see the positivity that we've had. About 6,000 people on our guided tours so far, obviously before the COVID, most of whom I would say were pretty secular people. And it, I think, does the image of religion a good turn when people whose interest is mainly in the green technologies come along and see that the religions are so active in terms of fighting climate change and promoting sustainable alternatives to burning hydrocarbons. So it, I think, is, in terms of missionary outreach, a good exercise, not specifically for Islam, I would say, but generically for monotheism and for religion. And that has been good to see that welcome from the outside world. So yeah, and so far, by the grace of God, the building is not letting in the rain, and the technologies are working. And I think that we have a lot of satisfied customers, but it has been an extraordinarily interesting journey, I must say. And I guess if we built it 10 years earlier, climate change would have been not so central to our radar and to everybody's radar. I think this is the beginning of a new generation of the building of sacred structures, obviously not just Muslim, but others as well. And I hope that as that catches on, and as existing mosques and churches, synagogues and other buildings start to green themselves up and do that quite conspicuously, I think, because it is an aspect of witnessing and mission, I think, that we demonstrate that we're useful to a wider humanity and not just to our own communities and congregants, that this will do quite a bit to change the image of religion generally in what has become a rather flabby and secular modern Britain. So that's our project. Apologies to those who are expecting a slightly more technical exposition of either the theology or of some of the technologies that reflect my limitations rather than the buildings. So thank you very much, and very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tim. I think, well, you've just sort of summarised in a way what I think has been so interesting about your talk is that you've brought in so many different aspects: the theology, practical side of things, the urgency of the climate change, the functionality of the building in the ways you've described. Thank you. And if anyone has questions, we'd love to hear them. I don't think there are any on the chat. So do, as I say, do remember to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question or wave your hand, or anybody have a question? There's Francis.
Well, I'm so bowled over by the talk, and that my chief thing that I want to say is immense gratitude to Tim Winter for giving such an astonishingly beautiful talk and explaining so intimately the theological aspects within the attitude to nature within Islamic religion. It's very, very moving, and I've never heard anything quite like it. So it's one of your audience has been deeply grateful for it. I don't think I've got a very well-formed question at all about it, except I'm intrigued to know practicalities, like what impact has it had on the local community, on the Islamic community? I know there's always been a mosque somewhere near the station, and that has this attracted a great increase in people coming into the building who want to use it as a place of worship?
That's a good question. I have a suspicion that because we've become so superficial in Britain, that one reason why people are staying away from places of worship is that they don't feel that they're cool particularly. So I'm a kind of fanatical lover of English country churches, but I can see that a lot of young people just don't relate at all to the iconography, to the ethos, to the solemnity, and they don't attend simply because of the building. And I don't know how you resolve that. But I'm pretty sure that if you give people a kind of funky, modern, but still dignified design, you'll double your congregation very quickly. So it's been interesting to see people coming to the mosque for the first time, including communities that we didn't really know existed, but it's really very diverse. And I didn't know we had a Venezuelan Muslim community in Cambridge, for instance, but they've introduced themselves. And it's good for these different communities, especially, I mentioned, quite a lot of people are quite isolated in Cambridge, even in the kind of majority white population. You know, we now have a ministry of loneliness in this country, which is profoundly depressing. There is an epidemic of anxiety and depression, and society is hurting. And it's really good to see how a place of worship can kind of present a place where people can go 5 times a day in order to feel less lonely. Students, during the lockdown, for instance, we found that there's students in Cambridge from overseas who hadn't been able to get back home, who were actually hungry. We had one Indian guy who came to the mosque saying he hadn't eaten for several days, literally. So there's a lot of people who fall through the cracks in our society. So we have a little food bank, and we've gone into a special COVID mode. And yeah, it really has been very heartening, without being too sentimental about it, to see how the whole community is pulled together, and how I think a lot of churches, for instance, have registered that there's an uptick in people contacting them and attending online services, and people are spending less time in clubs now and thinking about more serious things. So I think that there's a modest sort of religious resuscitation taking place, not just amongst Muslims, but generally. That may be the main silver lining in this rather grim time. So it's just been very reassuring to see even atheists, for instance, donating to the mosque because they just like the building and the atmosphere. And that's been important for some of the rather fearful, perhaps more elderly Muslim residents in Cambridge who are afraid of, racism. And we had the EDL, the English Defence League, marching against the mosque. The biggest ever police operation in South Cambridgeshire was the last time they came to protest against the mosque. And that does make a lot of the kind of elderly Bangladeshis with restaurants kind of unhappy and anxious. But overwhelmingly, the reaction from local residents of all faith communities has been really warm and positive. And I think it's been very, very beneficial for a community that feels a bit kind of marginalized and misunderstood to see that warmth.
So thank you.
It's very
wonderful.
Anyone else?
Yes, Tim, if I may. Hi, apologies for joining late. I came via the Friendless Churches, and I had a while finding this lovely lecture. So I've missed the first 15 minutes, which I'm very sorry. And I hope there is a website that I can look to find information about your eco credentials that you will put maybe on chat, or maybe you've already mentioned it. We have just opened, the Quakers in Hammersmith have just opened and then closed with a COVID,
yep.
A passive house, up to passive house standard, new meeting house. And we are looking forward to community outreach like yourselves. And I so look forward to visiting the mosque and learning. I'm sure on the website when it is open for visitors to come and, and see the building and also worship insofar as we are permitted. And I so appreciated the text that you quoted, and finding, as Quakers do, have a deep connection to the natural world that that runs like threads, sometimes very muted threads, throughout the faith. And I rejoice in learning of this new building and look forward to seeing it. Thank you so much for the lecture. Again, apologies for being so late.
That's kind. And actually, there are very interesting historic connections between the Quaker movement and at least translations of Islamic texts. One of our first professors of Arabic in Cambridge translated medieval Muslim text on the knowability of God through the natural world. And that was translated into English in the 17th century. And that was actually read by some of the early Quakers who found it very inspirational. So there's been a lot of sort of mutually beneficial interaction. And of course, I've often found that Muslims like visiting Quaker places of worship because there's no pictures. My son went to the Quaker school in Saffron Walden, and they were obviously hospitable people, but he also felt that the place where they had their assemblies in the morning was quite congenial to him. So there's some good relations there.
Thank you.
Can I introduce myself? I'm here with my husband's email on, but I'm actually the head teacher of a community primary school, and one of my colleagues is also on the call. I'm also familiar with another person here from our association with cathedrals over time. We're sitting in part of Ely Cathedral's deanery, which is 12th century, and I understand when you say you don't need air conditioning when you've got thick walls. So we're not quite as environmentally friendly as you are, but we aim in that direction. I've been meaning to visit you with my friend Becky, who was on that call. She's a colleague of mine, because we're looking at our curriculum development, and we really want to look at significant local, rich context, religious experiences for children, so that we teach all the children in our rural community, which is predominantly white British, to have a real understanding of the broader context of people's faiths and people's understanding of faith. And we're actually engaged in a project at the minute. So the very minute you're open to visitors, we're on your doorstep, Tim. But equally, we'd love to be in conversation anyway, because I think it's hugely important. I've loved what you said about the threads of climate, because that's something we are concerned about as a Fenland school. I love what you said about the drawing on the heritage of your local space to create what you have created. So you've contextualized what you're doing while simultaneously being fully Islamic, and I think that's really interesting and helpful. And I particularly like what you've been saying throughout this talk about the connections between the monotheistic faiths, because as a community primary school, albeit that I happen to be married to a guy in a dog collar, I do try really hard to ensure that people understand the kind of cousin relationship and the familiarities between people, so that they can draw on some really positive examples. And that whole history you just described of 1,000 years of kind of symbiotic sharing of what Gothic architecture might be, etc., etc., I think are hugely important for young people in the country today to hear about and understand, because there's far too much in the media and other national discourse that is divisive, and we should be, as a community primary school, be aiming at helping people to understand what connects them, not what divides them. So it's been really, really helpful and interesting to hear you today. And we signed up because we're desperate to come visit you anyway and connect with you and be able to bring children to visit you, so that we can share those broader experiences.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. I think we've been quite bowled over by the amount of interest, particularly from schools, and we do have sort of regular groups of school kids coming around. Obviously, it requires a certain amount of checking of staff beforehand and making sure they haven't got sort of sticky fingers. But generally, they really enjoy it, and they appreciate the experience. And the imam usually does a little recital so they can hear how the Quran sounds. Yeah, it's been a good experience. And actually, your bishop, Simon Conway, he came and visited.
Stephen Conway, yeah.
Yeah, and he really liked the building. We even talked about possibly swapping buildings at one point. He was bowled over by it.
Swap it with him.
we decided against it. But, Yeah, there's so many opportunities.
Mm.
I think that the pluralization of religion in England is an opportunity that we need to be making more use of. I know that the Hindu temple in Neasden in London is a go-to place for so many school groups, and I think we need to be building on that. But of course, it should be reciprocated. One of the things we have in our Cambridge Muslim College, which are separate but nearby seminary, is that we take graduates from the British Islamic seminaries, and we try to introduce them to the kind of Christian sacred landscape and traditions of the UK. So I think I'm the only person to have regularly taken groups of very conservative Muslim seminarians to Walsingham, for instance.
Right.
Well, that always create a stir. But it's important for them to realize that this country has a deep sacred sort of relationship with places and pilgrimages.
Yeah,
and
places of pilgrimage. Yeah.
Important for Muslims to realize that.
Mm-hmm. Really, really valuable. Thank you.
Alexis, do you have anything to?
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Tim. It was just so inspiring, so wonderful. On so many levels, and thank you for the lesson, the teaching you taught us as well. You didn't just present the mosque and the history of that, you taught us. It's so exciting because it's chiming so much with the new religion and worldviews curriculum, and the ideas of worldviews being understood in a sort of intersectional way. So it's not just faith perspectives, it might be eco-politics, it could be there's all sorts of things in play. And would you like to say something about that? I did have another question, maybe it's linked, which is it feels like the mosque itself, your work with it in the community is sort of, it is eco-theological activism, just the very fact of it, the birth of it. And how do you see that playing out now?
I think that, I mean, the world now can't deny what its materialism has produced. That this kind of turbo-capitalism and product addiction, which has been our major form of life for generations now, is threatening us all. And this is rather a good time to remind people of the not by bread alone basic idea of the religions, that the world is finite and our desires are infinite, and we need to be thinking a bit more carefully about where all of this is leading. So I wouldn't say it's a popular sermon topic in the Muslim world yet, but there's an obvious kind of basic religious point. Christianity and Islam both have traditions of renunciation and asceticism that are starting to look pretty sensible and responsible now. It wasn't the religious worlds that produced this catastrophe, it was modern scientific secular instrumentality. So the triumphalism of that secular narrative, I think, is breaking down. And this is quite a good time for, I guess, people of religions equally to present an alternative narrative and a more subtle view of how we should relate to the physical world. I don't know if that's exactly what you're looking for, but it's important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And even the aesthetic chimes with that, with what you're saying. The place has that simplicity. And even if one isn't to worship there, one can experience that.
Yeah, beauty is an argument. You can't go into Ely Cathedral without feeling that you're changed. Yeah. You go into the building, you're suddenly walking differently, you're a different person. And we're osmotic creatures as human beings, and sacred buildings, are very good reminders of something more serious within ourselves. So we hope that we're doing a bit of that as well in Cambridge.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi there. Yes, I just wanted to say thanks so much for the talk. I thought it was absolutely fascinating and very, very interesting. And I'm ashamed to say I haven't been around the mosque, even though I live in Cambridge myself, on the north side of Cambridge. But I was fascinated by the sacred geometry that you sort of touched on, and the 8-pointed star, or the sort of the petal sort of motif. I was very interested in that because I happen to be a sort of church architect, and I look after some churches around here, including Cherry Hinton.
Okay.
And mounted on the west wall of the tower there is a 12th century coffin lid of a very important person, obviously, who we think was probably a priest, perhaps, because he has his sort of hands in prayer like this. And there's just a simple sort of roundel sort of showing his head and rather large ears. So I'm afraid to say that the vicar refers to him as big ears, but that's another story. But beside, up in the corners, there are two little roundels with these 8-pointed sort of petal motifs. And I've always wondered what that meant, you know, and from what you're saying, they could be, you know, very, very rich in meaning, and perhaps, I don't know whether somebody from the 12th century, an educated sort of person, would have, I don't know, would there be sort of similar strands of meaning potentially from what you're saying?
That might indicate a particular sort of monastic affiliation. There might be, each of the monastic orders have a particular symbol. Sometimes it's a flower, sometimes it's a geometrical form that is a kind of code. So, but I'm not really an expert in such things. But it's quite likely that's what it would signify.
Right, okay. Thanks. No, just I'd like to get to the bottom of it one day. Yeah.
But it is the case that some of the symbolism does overlap, because there's a kind of shared Platonic Pythagorean vocabulary, and the Arabic texts were being translated into Latin, and there wasn't really an iron curtain between medieval Christendom and the world of Islam. A lot of ideas and music, poetry, and so forth did go backwards and forwards. So it's quite possible that is a symbol that would be shared. Yep.
Right, thanks.
Well, if there aren't any other questions this evening, I think we've rather beautifully just hit 8:05 or something. So thank you again for joining us. Really wonderful of you to have paid to join this live event. And we thank, clapping doesn't quite work on Zoom, but thank you again to Tim for a really rich and wonderful lecture. And I hope perhaps we can also perhaps stay in touch with you. I did forget to mention in the introduction, actually, that there is an Islamic Art Exhibition. Is that right? An exhibition? Or
it's one of our fundraising devices, I'm afraid. We're trying to get money out of you, but we have all kinds of beautiful Islamic calligraphic and geometrical artworks that have been donated to the mosque. And at the moment, we're halfway through our annual sale. So you can look at, I think it's cambridgeislamicart.org. Yeah. You can put in a bid, and some of it is quite hair-raisingly expensive, I'm afraid, but there are some more affordable pieces.
And there might be an 8-leaved flower or an 8-petaled flower. Sorry. Anyway, thank you again, and we'll see you hopefully at the next one. If you can join us, we've got our artist duo called Fourth Land, who are working away with the sister temple, actually, to the Neasden Temple, the Hindu temple in East London, in Leytonstone, and a church very nearby. And they're going to be talking about the project they've been doing there, which is all been underpinned by our relationship to the earth and nature. So join us for that if you can in 2 weeks' time. Goodbye then.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.